Hello, class, and welcome back to part two of our lecture on section one of the Renaissance. Today, we are going to talk about a very, very, very important part of how the Renaissance is different from the Middle Ages, in particular the High Middle Ages. And the big overarching philosophy that we're going to talk about over and over, whether it be the Italian Renaissance or the Northern Renaissance, is this idea of humanism. And humanism is an extremely important idea in the modern world. And the word itself gives it away. If you look, the big word here is human. And as we've seen through most of the High Middle Ages and the Dark Ages, the big focus is on the other world. It's on heaven and how you get there and things like that. Humanists begin to focus. There's still going to be religious people, but they're going to start to look at the world around us as a conceptualization of God's inherent love for us and beauty through the prism of the human experience. So a focus on more worldly things, not to say less religious, though. It's an intellectual focus on the world around you. Trees, a beautiful sunset, art and literature obviously will flow through this. A study of humanity, as opposed to most of the intellectual pursuits of the High Middle Ages are religious. If you think about Thomas Aquinas, he views the classical ideas of Plato and Aristotle through the prism of religion. If we look at most of the art, which we will, of the High Middle Ages, it deals with religion. If we look at most of the architecture, think about a cathedral, it is religious. Here it's starting to change. But again, the big mistake people make is they think of it as not the people of the Renaissance not being religious. They're not totally secular. They still are religious, obviously, but they start to focus on different things in the pursuit of knowledge. Um, During the High Middle Ages, obviously you've read about the medieval university system. We'll talk about this a little more in class. When you went to the medieval university, if you were lucky enough to be an elite in medieval society, you first got a degree in theology, and then you could either go study medicine or law. And those are the three big subjects. Humanists in the Renaissance start to think, wait a second, we need to go back to what they studied in Greece and Rome. What are the classical studies? And the classical studies we even today call the humanities. If you go to school, for college, I mean, to study the humanities, you would be looking at grammar, rhetoric, poetry, and history. So looking at all these different parts of the curriculum that would change. So again, humanists look at what is applicable to the human experience in the world, as opposed to simply saying that everything runs through theology or theological thought. Your great father of humanism. Anytime we talk about humanism, we must start with a look at the great Italian Renaissance figure, Francesco Petrarch, 1304 to 1374. We call him the father of humanism. He is a writer, a poet, a thinker, but he's really important that he goes to all these monasteries where throughout the Dark Ages and throughout the High Middle Ages, the only people keeping classical works of antiquity alive have been those monks in the scriptoriums. He goes down to the basements and he finds these works and he brings them up to the light and he translates them out of the Italian or the Greek, Latin or the Greek into Italian. And he really is the reason we understand the writings of antiquity. He's so important with all this. He brings us works from Cicero, from Homer, from the great Roman poet Virgil. So important with introducing a whole generation of humanists to these classical writers who were around before the time period of the church. We've talked about how important the Greeks and the Romans have been in our society. And we really have Petrarch to thank for bringing these back up to the light after all of these dark ages between 476 and the 1300s. But as a true Renaissance man, and what is the Renaissance all about, and what is humanism all about? It's taking things from antiquity and blending them with the modern. So, as a student of these early Roman and Greek poets, he takes their style, blends it with his own, and comes up with a whole new style. Again, total rebirth, totally a Renaissance thing to do. You would know him from your English classes, where you've probably learned about the Petrarchan, or we'd call it the Italian sonnet, a precursor to that written in by Shakespeare, which will come later in the Northern Renaissance, which would be the Shakespearean sonnet. This handsome fella here is Petrarch. If you can see here, you will notice up here is an indication of his study of antiquity. Okay, and again, you see the book here showing you how he's a scholar. But again, if we look up here, if you think about it, the idea of looking like a Roman emperor with the olive branch around his head, you can see it's indicating this picture that he is somebody who would study the Romans and the Greeks and be very knowledgeable with that. And here is an Italian version of one of his sonnets in Italian, if any of you speak that language. And here is the English version. We will be looking at this in class, and we'll be talking a little more about his great literary work, his great blending of antiquated ideas with modern ideas, which we call the Sonnets to Laura. And we'll talk about that in class. So you can read this if you want. I think it's pretty interesting, and if you can understand it, that's great. But we will look at this again in class. All of this brings about, as I've already said, this idea of humanism, of looking at the world around you and understanding it better, into a golden age for arts, okay, painting, writing, etc. The biggest thing we've already established in the first part of this online lecture was that without wealthy patrons in Italy, you would have no art. They need to pay for the artists. These artists then have the time because they're being paid for by an Italian merchant. They have a place to live. They have food. They can put all their energies into understanding art. And again, what is the Renaissance? They would look at Greek and Roman art, which is being rediscovered in Italy, and they would revive it and make it their own. It's very, very humanist. One of your earliest real great Renaissance artists is Donatello. He's from Florence. If you're from Florence, you're called a Florentine. And he would develop modern sculptural techniques using ideas from the classical period, using fully round and supported sculptures. We'll talk about all this in class, so I'm not going to go too much into it. But Donatello, one of your first great Renaissance artists as far as architecture. Filippo Brunelleschi, who we'll talk about in class. He will use new and classical techniques to develop a brand new idea of architecture where a dome, which was, again, made by the Romans, he could make a dome without any kind of support from the inside. The dome itself supported itself. So we're going to look at his great masterpiece, the Duomo in modern Florence. And as we've seen, what is humanism? The art, what the art is about, will start to move away from religious scenes into realistic images. We have the birth of portraits where wealthy merchants would want their picture painted. Okay, that's not religious. It's humanist. Okay, that's not to say a lot of these guys will not have religious themes, but even when they paint Jesus or Mary, they paint it as a woman and a child, the Madonna and the child. They would use human models for this. So even their religious paintings are going to have some kind of humanist theme. We're going to look at all these in class, so you'll see that. A huge idea in the Renaissance is the idea of perspective, which we're going to talk about in class, which gets developed. You have the idea of a vanishing point, and it gives paintings a three-dimensional depth, which we don't see in the Middle Ages. It's a huge leap forward because these guys would have studied the classics. The Greeks and the Romans had much better architecture than they eventually have in the Dark Ages. The High Middle Ages, that's a little different with the idea of cathedrals and whatnot. But this is important, this idea of perspective. You would be looking at paintings today saying, oh, you don't even notice it as perspective. But then if you see a painting from the Middle Ages, you're like, oh, it's so flat and terrible. Not terrible, we'll look at that, but we'll be able to look in class at the differences. And this blending of techniques brings about modern art, not in the conceptual term of like modern art when you think about some different artists of the 20th century. More modern art is in we're moving out of what would be Middle Ages art into some artistic methods in architecture that are still used today. Your three geniuses of Renaissance art you have all probably heard about. It's very, very known in our society and culture who these artists are. And again, we'll be looking at their works in class, so you'll learn even more about them. The real genius everybody's ever heard about is Leonardo da Vinci, living at this time period, 1452 to 1519. Again, true Renaissance man as a humanist, studies biology, anatomy, hydraulics, the use of water and engines, mechanics, aeronautics. We're going to talk all about him in class. His famous paintings that you would know are the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. Okay, everybody's heard of the Mona Lisa. We'll look at all this, so don't stress about it till we talk about it in class. Michelangelo, okay, 1475 to 1564. Also a painter most famous for his sculptures, actually, but you actually probably know him more for his painting of frescoes in the Sistine Chapel. But he's famous for, as I said, the Sistine Chapel, the David, the Pietà, and he also designs the whole of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. If any of you have ever been to the Vatican, the giant dome there is designed by Michelangelo. And a bit younger than these two gentlemen is Raphael, 1483 to 1520. He's a painter, and he's very famous for his pictures of Madonna and Child, many different variations of using different models and babies to paint Mary and Jesus. Okay, but he also has the Assumption of the Virgin, and his great humanist painting that everybody loves is the School of Athens. We will be looking at all of these paintings in class, so we'll go all through those. Here we see this would be Donatello. Okay, over here is Filippo Brunelleschi. Here we see a young Raphael. Okay, here is a self-portrait of a very old Leonardo da Vinci. And over here is a Michelangelo. So you can tell, if anybody of you like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, now you obviously know they were named after Renaissance artists, if you didn't know that already. This is also a time of writing. Lots of Renaissance writing. So remember, this idea of humanism will be reflected in the writing as well, moving away from writing about religious themes into examining humans. One of your early famous Renaissance writers in Italy is Baldassare Castiglione, 1478 to 1529. And he examines nothing religious. He examines how do you get ahead in life? What's a good way to have social advancement? And he writes a book called The Book of the Courtier. And it shows young nobility. He writes to the nobility, not to peasants or anybody. How do you move up in the world? How do you act and move up in the world? This is interesting. If we think all the way back to the beginning of the year and the instructions of Teotep, thousands of years before this, people were concerned with the same thing. How do you act if you are ambitious? And so the Book of the Courtier, we'll read some of this in class, but that's very humanist, okay? The most famous Renaissance writer from Renaissance Italy is deeply involved in the politics of Florence. He is the right-hand man of the Medicis, falls out of favor in that with them, ends up moving around Italy and really examining what is power. His name is Niccolo Machiavelli, and he writes the most famous Renaissance book of all time, still read today, The Prince. And it guides rulers on how to gain and keep power. And that's so important. It's so humanist. It's not about religion. It's about how do I become an extremely strong ruler. And so we have some famous quotes from here. You would have probably heard the quote, "It's better to be feared than loved." This comes from Machiavelli. Okay, also, the ends justify the means. So think about these quotes, and I'm going to show you on the next page some more quotes from Machiavelli. We're going to go through this in class. Okay, up here, we do see Niccolo Machiavelli. Okay, and here are some quotes you can read by him. But I will be going over The Prince in class. I don't want to go through all these in the audio lecture. You've been bored by me enough at this point, I'm sure. So read some of these quotes, and we will go into them in class. But very humanist, very important when we think about where is power, where does it come from. Next up, when we begin the next lecture, we will be talking about the Renaissance moving into the North. So that will be the next online lecture. Thank you for listening, and hopefully you have not fallen asleep at your computer screen at this point, because the Renaissance is pretty exciting. We'll be looking at a lot of the art and reading a lot of literature in class, which will be very, very interesting, I hope. Thanks again. Have a great day.